Hi everyone, this is Pierrick from P2 Design with a new time-lapse video where I'll be showing you how I have created this new creature from the creature box concept. In this first video I will cover the main steps to create this creature and show you how I have exported it to Cycles rendering but also Eevee. It was just a test, I didn't go really in depth into it, but the result is pretty nice, and you can also check the model on Sketchfab. I generally start with a simple cube that I subdivide and apply the subdivision modifier so that I have a nice base shape. Then I switch to sculpting with dynamic topology so that it will create automatically and generate geometry for me. So I've sculpted the main shapes like the mouth and the sockets for the eyes, and I will put some placeholder for the arms and the legs. Also using the subdivided cube as a base mesh. I didn't use the skin modifier because as the character is pretty bold, it wasn't really the good way for me, and I felt more comfortable using directly cubes that I will sculpt and adjust one on top of the other. I've kept the arms, legs, and the body separated for a while because it was easier for me to hide them, and it was more convenient to sculpt the different features. I'm using the sculpting add-on, which allows me to extract the masked part as a new mesh and start sculpting the tail of the whale. As I struggled modeling this part, sculpting it, I've drawn it rapidly with the grease pencil to have a look at how it has to be, and then started modeling it with the skin modifier. Once happy with this part, I've booleaned the legs with the body and start sculpting some details using simple muscle flow just to throw some basic shapes. At this stage I don't go that much into details, even if I had some wrinkles and stuff like this, just to see if the character is currently walking, and it helps me reading the proportions. I had some details on the ears or the tail, I don't know how to say it, before I go for retopology and just make some retouch and reshapes on the main surface and the main shape of the character. I always start retopology with a simple face that I snap on the surface. I don't use the shrink wrap modifier while I'm doing the retopology because I don't really like it. Using it in the same time as you are modeling. I think that using multiple point projection and the simple snapping tool is okay. So I just set the main loops around the eyes, around the mouth, on the forehead, trying not to go crazy in the density of my mesh. I'm not aiming to do any animation with it, so I could have made some bad topology also, but having a decent at least topology will help me working on the UVs and also when I will sculpt fine details. I've made a copy of the dintopol sculpt and use a decimate modifier to reduce the poly count, and then just isolate the arm by deleting all other vertices. That will help me making the retopology in this place, as the body and the arm were very close one to each other. It was hard to access this area. I've modeled the foot nails as separated mesh because it will be easier for me to flesh out the foot and add some skin around the nail if it's a separated mesh. Once the sculpting and retopology is done, I go with a shrink wrap modifier and a multi-res modifier so that I can source the details from the Dintopol sculpt onto my retopologized mesh. Then it's just a matter of correcting the artifact that occurred during the projection and add some finer details. I had to try creating the little shells from pure geometry, box modeling them, but I was not successful with this, so I decided to go as usual with dynamic topology first, retopology, and then projection, because I feel like I have more freedom and it's easier for me to do it this way. Then it was time to model the rope, so I first tested this using a twisting effect, but it was not the good method for it. This kinda braid shape didn't work, so I've decided to make it really more simple, as you would do a shell or something, and then using the array modifier and trying to match and merge the different sections, that will allow me to have pure control on the shape of the rope. Instead of having two braid, I had only one circular shape that I would propagate this way. Then I just have to use a curve modifier and simply extrude the curve around my character and shape the rope he's wearing. I then go for a retopology of the shell, so it was pretty easy. I've started with a projected circle onto the surface, also using the snapping tool as before, and then just make a decent topology of those shells. I've directly box modeled the teeth and then go for some sculpting using a multi-resolution modifier. That was the easiest way and the fastest way, as their global shape is pretty simple. I used the same process for the arrow and the wooden stick. As their shape was very simple, I prefer to model it directly, add enough loop, try to keep square faces, etc., and sculpt directly on it. That's easier than going into dynamic topology and make a retopology afterward just to source like one or two extra details. This would have been a waste of time, so I did it this way. I can now create the second rope, starting from the arrow and flowing on the ground. I've also used the curve to make the base shape of the pipe and then converted it to be a base mesh and refined its shape afterward. It was now time to create my UVs, so I've done it quite as usual, separating the different part of the body, the arms, leg, some part of the face, trying not to show the seams that much, but I'm not worried about it. Generally, when you go with painting and use the bleeding tool and stuff like this, you don't see the seam afterward. So I've decided to gather as much UVs as possible on the same map, because I was aiming to go for a real-time rendering and I didn't want it to have a UV for each object. So I've gathered everything on one map and only the ropes were on a separated UV map. I've also created my own theme where I have modified the way the other object UVs appear in the UV image editor, so that they were green, and it was really easier for me to identify the position of the different elements. Before baking, I've created this shape key to push the legs in to avoid self-clipping of the mesh while baking and creating artifacts. So I've started by baking the AO on everything, and you can see here that I'm not using, as I told you, the same UV for the rope. I've decided to create two different UV islands, one per I don't know, piece of the rope, and another with a straight projection, so that it might be useful later on if I wanted to create any generated texture or so to be projected on it. Once AO and curvature or pointiness map were baked, I started painting the base color. So I always start with a simple color system and work very widely. I don't go that much into detail, because the detail of the map will be sourced from the baked AO and the baked cavity map or curvature or pointiness, as you wish. So I just go for a simple color scheme, and if it doesn't work at this stage, if you can't see your character taking life, it means that your color scheme is not good. Don't go too much into detail if the simplest part of it doesn't work. You don't need to. Adding detail won't save your character. That's like a bad sculpt. If the base mesh is not good or the base proportion are not correct, adding skin pores and wrinkles won't save your project. You will just waste time sculpting details on something that doesn't work. I've really rapidly painted a bump map just to add some subtle skin pores and finer detail on the skin. I've then created an ID mask by painting a solid color onto my UVs. This will allow me to create different masks by using the separate RGB nodes later on. In Cycle, I can combine the curvature AO and the color map to create a more complex skin pattern and skin color. I've also combined real-world texture using the ID mask to separate the different material. This will at the end allow me to have only one material for the whole character and output as less maps as possible for the real-time rendering. So the whole thing turned a bit heavy on Node, but at the end I will be able to bake all this complex setup into really simple maps. So as I go along, you can create very complex things, just adding simple and simple and simple thing one after each other. I will then paint a roughness map using a texture mask and some randomness and jitteriness to make it more natural. I'm not focusing on something really specific here. I will just add some more shininess on the lips and around the eyes and on the forehead. Same process for the rope material and texture. I will combine real world texture with the baked AO and curvature and create a simple color scheme for this. For the eyes iris, I use a file that I'm always using for all my character when I want to go fast. It's a photo-based iris that I have cleaned up and add just a hue and saturation filter in Photoshop so that I can change its color. So it's really simple, and I then convert it to a map and do stuff like this. I paint the veins on a black and white texture that will be also used for the mapping, and it will be used as a factor for a red color on the sclera of the eye. Then I paint a transparency mask that will allow us to see the iris through the sclera, or I don't know exactly the name of this part of the eye, but you can see it's pretty obvious. I set my character to a pure white diffuse, so it allows me to set my lighting using an HDRI as the main light source, and also a few plane with an emission shader to create the rim lighting. I will add later on a fill light with a simple area lamp with a very low strength, and then I've started the shading. So I use my painted roughness map to combine a simple glossy shader with my diffuse shader, sourcing the complex color map we have created before, and then I just try to mix them using the roughness values and also some Fresnel effect. So I now have to create this new map, which will be our subsurface scattering scaling map. This will allow me to drive the scale of the subsurface scattering onto my character. So I always go like crazy white for the ears, or here our tail, we don't really know what this is, and around the eye and the mouth. So I will go back and forth on this map because it took me some time to figure out the SSS cal, because I was using very dark color for the base color of my character, and it override, or I don't know, it did kill the subsurface scattering effect. So I figured this later on, and the result was nice at the end, so that's fine. At the very beginning I was using the Pro Lightning Sky, but the problem that I've seen is that as it's only Sky HDRI, The reflectivity on the eye, for example, was cut in half because of the horizon. So I've decided to use an HDRI that I always use for my character. It's the parking lot free HDRI, pretty common, because it has mid-tone lighting, so that's pretty easy to be used. And I've also added those two spheres, one which is pure diffuse and one pure glossy, to help me figuring out if the lighting is good and where is the sun on the HDRI. I've also creating a super simple air system on the ropes just to make them a little more interesting. It brings some additional details which are fine. I've painted some drops of color on the ground and I will then mix them with a transparent shader so that the square will disappear. I've tried to model the bubbles using Metaball without success, so I decided to make them by hand using a simple UV sphere that I will blend together using Bridge Edge Loop. I've made the bubble shader using a color ramp and using the facing node just to create this nice color transition based on the Fresnel effect, even if it's not 100% or at all physically accurate, it does work. So that's all we want. I then created two render layers, one for my character and another for the bubbles, because I wanted to remove the emission plane from the bubble render layer because it creates some sharp reflected shapes on those and it was not natural. Once I was done, I just go for creating some render layer output to save the different passes I have selected. When it comes to creating this kind of stuff, I always go crazy with the different passes, and I finally only used like 3 of them for like the AO, the shadow, no, not even the shadow, but the color pass, etc. But I prefer to have the control, having all of them. Then in Photoshop, I just combine them using overlay with subtle factors, and then I just work on curves, add some background color, add some transparency to the bubbles because there were two popping out, and as they transmit the HDRI background, it may not fit my current background on the artwork. So I faked this transparency, added some glow, then go for some filtering with Photoshop Camera Raw, which allow me to make some subtle hue and saturation and contrast balance in the colors. And here we are with the final result. Once I was happy with my cycles rendering, I've just duplicated my mesh and applied the first level on multi-resolution to have a base mesh with a slightly increased number of faces, of vertices, because the base mesh was really simple. Once done, I've baked the normal, sourcing the former mesh, which had the multi-resolution, on the new one. And this is why I've also used the displacement output while creating my shaders. I never use it, I always use bump node, but the fact that you use it when you will bake the normal map, all the details that you put into the displacement output of the material node will also be baked as a normal map. And it allows me to bake both the generated bumpiness sourced from wooden map, etc., but also the current normal map from the multi-resolution modifier and the painted bump map into a single normal map that I will be able to combine then in the Eevee render engine. So I've struggled a bit at the beginning because I get some weird reaction, and also the UI is not quite the same as the current one in Blender 2.7.8. So okay, I was just testing things out until I found the way it works, at least the very basic, and I've tried to combine the bait map into Eevee. I wasn't able to play with transparency in Eevee. I don't know if it is yet available, or if you have to use an alpha factor or something to play with it. So I found a trick to cheat and get some transparency on the bubbles and stuff like that, using an emission with the same color as the background and making them blending together. For the eyes, I've just used a mask modifier to remove the part that were occluding the eye, but doesn't seem to work in the Eevee engine, so I just remove the useless vertices and go for render. So I've been struggling a bit with Eevee, but it was the very first time I opened it, and I think that with some work this can become one of my favorite render engine. Anyway, I'm really happy to see this happening in Blender, and I'm really looking forward all the new stuff on it. So I hope you've enjoyed this time-lapse, and you can watch the full time-lapse video, which will be like an hour or so, and I'll see you very, very soon.